It's set up as a debate. I am very enthusiastic about this format, and very grateful to Aaron Regent and Heather and his family for supporting this event. The topic lends itself naturally to it, as very many do. We've long wanted to have this type of clash of ideas in a civilized and civil, and perhaps even occasionally humorous format. And Aaron stepping forward to doing this was just a terrific spur for it. At this point, I think, Aaron, I should invite you to come and make some remarks of your own. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Aaron and thanking him for his support.
I feel like at some dinners where you're standing in the way of the main event, so I better be quick in my remarks. But Bill, thank you for that introduction. And I'd also like to welcome everyone here tonight and to thank you for demonstrating your interest in public policy, which I think reflects our shared passion and care for this great country that we live in. Heather and I feel deeply honored to be associated with the Institute, and in our own small way to do what we personally can to help support the development of smart policies for Canada. We are fortunate to be able to call Canada home. It is a great country, an example to the world, and an amazing place to live, work, invest, and raise a family. But we also know that we can't be complacent. In a global world, prosperity is not a given, and we must constantly seek out ways to make our country stronger, fairer, and more prosperous for all its people. And this is what the C.D. Howe Institute is all about. At a time when partisanship seems so high, the Institute's unique national voice is more important than ever. It is trusted as a critical source of reasoned, nonpartisan policy debate for the entire country. And if you want proof, just look at the quality of tonight's debaters and the fact we have representatives from every major political party represented on the jury tonight, together with business and academic leaders. This is a testament to the Institute's unique role as trusted policy advisor to the nation. And having served on the board of the Institute since 2005, I have an insider's view of the quality and independence of its work and contribution to smart policy. So tonight is meant to build on the work of the Institute by the introduction of this debate series. The goal is to develop a marquee platform for serious discussion on issues that are critical to Canada's future, and I think tonight's topic reflects this. How governments should respond to support workers buffeted by the stormy seas of technological change is really at the heart of tonight's discussion. It is complex and a timely subject. So I think tonight will be fun. It should be informative and thought-provoking. To our guests, jury, and to Paul, Hugh, Janice, and Conrad, who will shortly be introduced, thank you for honoring us with your presence, and thank you for coming to the Institute. I would also like to thank Bill, Duncan, and the entire team at the C.D. Howe for organizing this event. Now, before I close, I would like to acknowledge the passing of an old friend and colleague, Peter Munk. He was a great Canadian and an inspiration to so many of us. And these debates were in part inspired by the Munk debates, which demonstrated the power of debate in informing, educating, and persuading. Peter was a strong supporter of the Institute, one of our biggest donors, in fact. I know he would be supporting our efforts here tonight, and would most certainly be in the front row cheering on the discussion if he could. His passing is felt by many and was a real loss to the country. With that, again, thank you all for coming. This is just the start of many greats to follow.
Well, Aaron, thank you very much for those kind words, and also for the entirely appropriate tribute to Peter Munk. Indeed, an inspiration to all of us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very tight schedule, and I, at the risk of appearing tendentious, will thank the debaters in advance for their willingness to submit to it. In order to make sure that we can proceed in a timely fashion, I will direct you for the only time this evening to what in the trade we call your event collateral. The rest of the time, I know your attention is going to be firmly on the front of the room. But the biographies, the qualifications of Paul Begala, Hugh Segal, Conrad Black, and Janice McKinnon are so their accomplishments, their credentials, the interesting details of their biographies, their life experiences are too much for me to do justice to in the time that's available. What I will say, and echoing what Aaron has said already, is that they are eminently qualified to be here in front of you today by virtue of their intellectual knowledge, by virtue of their practical experience, and by virtue of their eloquence. So Paul Begala, a political commentator on CNN, extensive experience in the U.S. Political system, the Obama White House. He's very well known as a public figure. And greatly admired by his friends. Hugh Segal, currently principal at Massey College, has been a senator, has been a head of a think tank, has done all kinds of things, and in addition to his various public roles, has had a particular passion for this topic for quite some time. Conrad Black, extremely well known for expressing cogent views on a wide variety of public policy issues, remarkable business career, founder of the National Post, really did wonders for journalism in this country. And he continues as an author of scholarly work and as a contributor to popular discussion to make major contributions. Janice McKinnon, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Order of Canada, former Saskatchewan Finance Minister, Chair of the IRPP. I'm not only giving you a small amount of what's here. Experienced parliamentarian, also with a passion for the topic. I think could have argued either side of it. So we're looking forward very much to hearing what everyone has to say. Here's how it shapes up in terms of the event. It is sort of a traditional parliamentary debating format with the proposition and the opposition taking turns. They've agreed to be quite concise. We have the famous, or soon to be famous, C.D. House timekeeping paddles. The thank you is a bit passive aggressive, I know, but passive aggressive works, right? Like that's why. So that's what we will be doing as they make their opening comments, rebuttals, quick rejoinders, and then we will have questions from the jury that will be read out by jury foreman Hugh McKinnon, who has a few other duties. Let me mention also the jury. It's an outstanding group in its own right. Aaron, Anita Anand, Charles Beach, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, Raj Goel, Sylvia Jones, the Honorable Lisa Raitt, Nathan Rotman, and Neil Yates. And again, I can't do them justice. It's all here in your event collateral. What we are going to do now, if the technology is ready and my colleagues are ready, is to have an initial vote. The jury has paper ballots. So we can always go to a verification if there's any concern about online jiggery-pokery. The rest of you, though, if there are any hackers, you might just be at their mercy because we're going to use these clickers. And the idea is that we will have an initial view from the audience and from the jury about their thoughts on this topic. Should Western democracies establish a universal basic income? I have been instructed by my colleagues, and I follow their instructions, that we have 30 seconds for the clickers to do their magic, of course assisted by your digital pressure. I look around the room to my colleagues to see if I've got that right. If I do, I believe we're ready for the voting to begin. So this is going to be a long 30 seconds, the longest 30 seconds we will experience during the evening. Oh, wait, somebody said that. Yeah, economist jokes. If you laid them all end to end, they'd never reach a conclusion. If you had all the cars in the world, end to end, some idiot would try and pass them. I've always liked that one. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Are we there? So, among the audience, it's a bit of a even split. Hugh is examining his fellow jury members, wondering how that happened. Well, ladies and gentlemen, all I can say is it's a good thing that the team for the affirmative is as powerful as it is. because the jury has set a slightly high bar in terms of winning over further members. But we now go to the opening statements from our debaters. Paul Begala, welcome. It's terrific to have you here, and you have the opening 5 minutes, sir.
Bill, thank you. Should I come up here?
From where you are, if you're comfortable.
I prefer to stand, just so that, because I'm short anyway. I can barely see over the podium as it is. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Thank you for having me. What an honor. Aaron, thank you for sponsoring this. I'm flattered. I'm honored. I'm a little awed. I'm the only non-Canadian in this debate. I will say in my own defense, I honeymooned in Canada. That's something. That's not nothing. I probably qualify me to be an ambassador. So of course on the honeymoon we went to the Banff, Jasper, Lake Louise, some of the most beautiful places in the world, or so they tell me. I mean, it was our honeymoon. And since then I've traveled across your country many, many times and absolutely love it, and have been blessed to bring my children here many times. And yet I don't pretend to know your country or its culture. I've worked in politics really all around the world, and not yet here. I would like to one day, but I think the best description of the difference between my country and yours was actually given to me by a fishing guide I was fishing with on the Kananaskis River, who said, Canada really is just like America, except fewer guns and more health care. I thought, well, that's pretty good. I'm just glad you haven't built a wall yet. So tonight I am here to argue in the affirmative on this question. Should Western democracies such as Canada establish a universal basic income to help their children cope, their citizens cope with the disruptive effects of new technologies and artificial intelligence? My arguments begin with an assessment of the ongoing and accelerating decline of work, then the case for universal basic income, where it's been tried and it's been successful, why it's consonant with a strong work ethic, and why universal basic income is actually less expensive than one might think. First, we face, as do all Western democracies, a crisis of work. Automation, technology, artificial intelligence are changing the very nature of work itself in profound ways, ways that I argue are different from previous technological innovations. The scope is vast. A McKinsey study estimates that 800 million workers around the world will lose their jobs to technology by 2030. There was a study in Britain that said 35% of all jobs in the United Kingdom will be taken by robots by the year 2034. And in the year 2034, that study will be updated, of course, by robots. Some of the new jobs being created are great, but many are not. In the United States, the top 2 categories of jobs being created are personal care aides and fast food workers. Honorable work, to be sure, but low paying. Fast food worker in the States earns $19,000 a year. A personal care aide earns $22,000 a year. I take my lessons on this from the late, great Ray Charles, who once, when asked, what's the worst part about being blind, he said, you can't see. Well, the worst part about being poor is you don't have enough money. It's really that simple. Universal basic income is a concept so simple, so direct, so obvious that even politicians are beginning to understand it. In my country, Alaska has the highest unemployment rate, 7.3%, nearly double the national average in the States. Hawaii has the lowest, at 2.1%. And yet the poverty rate in Alaska, where the cost of living is the highest in the US, is significantly lower than in Hawaii. How can it be that in the state with the highest unemployment rate, they have significantly less poverty than the state with the lowest unemployment rate? Why? Universal basic income. For decades, Alaska has shared its oil wealth among all its citizens. Each year, residents who live there year-round receive a direct payment. Last year was about $1,100. Some years it's been over $2,000 for every man, woman, and child in Alaska. Not enough to live on, but enough to lift millions of Alaskans above the poverty line. Another policy that we tried when I worked in the Clinton White House was the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a refundable tax credit that rewards work, especially low-wage work. Originally signed into law in a much smaller scale by the noted Marxist Ronald Reagan, who upon signing the law called it, and I quote, the best anti-poverty, the best pro-family, the best job creation measure to come out of Congress. Today, a family of 4 in the States with a combined income of $45,000 or less can qualify for $5,500 in additional income through the Earned Income Tax Credit. And as you well know in your country, Ontario is experimenting with universal basic income. in Europe. The Finns are. In the States, the city of Oakland is trying an interesting experiment, and the results, while early, are encouraging. Less bureaucracy, more dignity, less poverty, more security. Unlike traditional welfare, which can create a disincentive to work by reducing welfare payments as income rises, universal basic income is just that. It's universal. People want to work. But if they spend all day in welfare lines, or if their welfare is reduced when they do work, then a job is far less feasible and far less attractive. In Alaska, only 1% of residents say the fact that they get an annual payment causes them to work less, while the increased purchasing power from that basic payment has created 10,000 jobs in Alaska.
Thank you very much for those. You got us off to a very strong start, Paul, for your substance and for keeping the time. Thank you very much. We now go to Janice McKinnon.
My first decision is whether to stand or sit. I think I'll stand. I'll get this right out here. Good evening. As Saskatchewan Minister of Social Services, I was involved in early stages of the National Child Benefit, a model for modern social programs. It was targeted at a specific problem: poor children growing up in families whose parents were on welfare. It provided support for the children, free eyeglasses, dental services, prescription drugs, and it incentivized the parents to move from welfare to work. Today, we are facing what has been called the fourth industrial revolution, in which AI and new technologies will cause significant job displacement, with the loss of some jobs and the creation of new ones. What is required to meet this challenge is not a one-size-fits-all universal payment to all people, but an approach that targets a specific problem: the need to transition people at risk of job loss into new careers. A recent study by the World Economic Forum modeled the jobs most likely to disappear and the new ones that emerged. It recommended investments in reskilling that will bridge workers into new jobs and in financial support to help workers make the transition. It concluded that with a targeted, evidence-based, long-term plan, 96% of workers at risk of being displaced would find good fit job transitions. With the UI, the focus is paying on all people. All people get paid, no incentives to work, and few resources left over for the major retraining that is required for displaced workers. But we can't afford to just hope that these recipients will find the appropriate training for the jobs of the future and decide to enter the workforce. With an aging population, Canada needs to incentivize all Canadians able to work to remain or enter the workforce. Also, reskilling and upskilling the workforce will enhance our productivity, which is essential to improving everyone's standard of living. Studies have shown that paid work, even subsidized paid work, is more effective than government transfers in helping people escape poverty. And Canadians value hard work and believe that government support should be linked to work or training for work. The other main problem with the UBI is its costs. Estimates show that depending on the design, it would cost as much as $300 to $400 billion a year, more than the whole federal budget. Now, advocates of the UBI say, well, other programs are going to be ended to help offset the costs. Which ones? Seniors' benefits, subsidies for housing, daycare, training, legal aid? One proposal for funding the UBI recommended actually eliminating the Canada Workers' Benefit, which subsidizes the wages of low-income Canadians in the workforce. The economists argue that if you want to help pay for the UBI by eliminating other programs beyond health and social programs would be cannibalized. But eliminating other programs won't come close to paying for the UBI. Taxes have to be raised. Now, there's no more room to raise high income and corporate taxes in Canada, since governments across Canada have already raised these taxes to the point that Canada has a competitiveness problem, especially considering what's happening to taxes and regulations in the United States. Advocates for the UBI have modeled new changes to the tax system. But what do they show? It shows, yes, the incomes of low-income Canadians will increase, but in the models, a person at $55,000 a year income would lose 12% of their income. And many would see their income taxes increase by more than 50%. The other problem, besides the affordability of these tax increases, is Canadians support social programs like this, but not increased taxes. The final problem with the UBI is it treats the symptoms of poverty, inadequate income, but doesn't get to the root causes. What causes people to be poor? What can be done to prevent poverty? What tools can we give these people to help raise themselves out of poverty into a better life? So it's expensive, it would raise taxes, and why?
So close, thank you. No, terrific, and many excellent points. Thank you, Janice. We now go to Hugh.
Thank you, Bill. It's very unnerving for me to look across the room and see so many people from previous parts of my life. They know more about me than I do about them, and that makes me humbled in my presentation. Queen's Park, Massey College, University of Toronto, Queens itself, which is more substantial than Queen's Park, we understand that. Brother Beach, I'm appealing for your vote because I'm not sure where you were on the issue. Former campaigns, not of all of which were, as you will know from my career, successful. Good to see you. Always glad to have you here. My colleagues at Aird and Bearless, who are tolerant and supportive. So I will be humble in my presentation, except to say this. Janice made some very good points. None of them relate to the issue at hand. The issue at hand is that democracies survive because there's a basic sense of fairness within the structure of those democracies. And when that sense of fairness goes, that's when you face the instability and the other difficulties which are substantive. Poverty, as my colleague said, is actually about not having enough money. The notion that, there's many complex causes to poverty, we have to get at them. If we took every penny that the provinces and the federal government had and we spent them against all those problems, we couldn't solve them. But we can actually solve poverty by topping up people who live beneath the poverty line so they can live a slightly better life. And when people say we can't afford this, colleagues, in the 07-08 economic meltdown, Canada, which, according to my Prime Minister, did not bail out the banks. Remember that? We did not bail out the banks. Jim Flaherty, God rest his soul, we did not bail out the banks. But we found $362 billion in central mortgage and housing to buy perfectly good mortgages off their balance sheets so they'd have the liquidity they needed because of the liquidity meltdown in the United States. So it wasn't a bailout. The mortgages were performing. They're of value to the taxpayer as we sit here. It wasn't a bad thing to do, but this is about if we can find liquidity for the most powerful parts of our economy. What about the low end of the population? The 9% living beneath the poverty line, the 15% in rural Canada. The numbers in the Atlantic region are worse. What about our First Nation brothers and sisters who are at third world levels of poverty? We have liquidity for the banks, but we don't have any liquidity for them. And the core question that democracies have to address, because as we stand here and sit here tonight, there is now an alternative model out there. Our Chinese friends, our Russian friends. You can have economic growth and expansion and one road and one belt and all that stuff. The only thing you don't need is pluralism, tolerance, and democracy. Well, I happen to think that I have to be careful here because I'm going to mention Mr. Roosevelt, and the next speaker is maybe the greatest Canadian expert on Mr. Roosevelt, so I'm being prudent. But Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill met on two battleships, 1941 in World War II. And they came up with something called the Atlantic Charter, which was tied to two freedoms. freedom from fear and freedom from want. And all of the free world that emerged therefrom after the end of the Nazis, NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, the WTO, were based on those two freedoms. And those two freedoms are still fundamental to how democracies and the role of democracy worldwide is sustained. The present test in this province, 1 minute, the present test in this province is not about what is referred to as the UBI, where everybody gets money just for breathing. No one's ever suggested that for a nanosecond. It's a top-up for people who are beneath the poverty line. And just so we are clear, no welfare payment system in Canada pays anybody beneath the poverty line more than 40% of the poverty line. Let's be clear. And, as others have said, it discourages work, as Paul suggested. But the top-up being tested in Ontario, which we did for our senior citizens in 1975, reducing the level of poverty from 35% to 3% in 3 years. William Grenville Davis, something called a progressive conservative. I know we don't remember what that meant, but that is the challenge that we have to face. And the notion that we can't afford it is like saying we're not prepared to fight a disease which destroys the fiber of our society.
Hugh, thank you for that appropriately wide horizon view of it, and also, should our fourth speaker choose to take advantage of it, an opportunity for a segue. Conrad Black, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for your kind reference, Hugh. I was a little disappointed you left out where we met when we were trying to promote the father of the present Chief Justice of this country as the leader of the Federal Conservative Party, and to spare the country what is widely known as the Joe Clark era. Always a pleasure to speak at C.D. Howe. He was a great hero in our family. He was a patron of my father's, and particularly with an American who honeymooned in Canada. I believe you are the second most famous American to do that after Calvin Coolidge. And since you quoted Ray Charles, I would say of the subject tonight that, as Mark Twain said of Richard Wagner's music, it's not as bad as it sounds. I had thought that I was to attack Hugh's scheme of $1,300 a month for everybody. If all you were talking about, Hugh, is topping up people beneath the poverty level, then the gulf between us is not as great as I feared. Let me enunciate a few things that I think we can all agree on, and then propose a different approach. Capitalism is the only system that works because it is the only one that is aligned with the almost universal human desire for more. And we like to share a little up to a point, but we all want more. And the problem with such a system is, in the pursuit of more, you do get excesses that eventually produce great problems that go by default to governments to settle, not because they have any aptitude to do it, but because that's where the buck stops, and they enact and enforce the laws, and they control the money supply. And if they don't deal with the crises, you get a complete collapse of the system, which has not happened in the English-speaking countries, but has happened in other great countries: France, Italy, Germany, Russia, Spain, China, and Mexico, Brazil, many places. And we have avoided that. Now, I think we can also agree that President Reagan, who was very generously referred to, was right when he said the only welfare system we've ever had that worked was a job. And I put it to you that our welfare system should, as my colleague Janice said, be oriented towards job creation. Several of the preceding, or two of the three preceding speakers, emphasized very rightly the point that we are now in a situation where we have a difficult demographic state of affairs, because not only do we have a shrinking birth rate and an increasing life expectancy, but, and this was not emphasized, we have a completely unsustainable number of people in jobs that do not add value. Now, a pizza delivery person or a health worker do add value, But frankly, a great many lawyers and accountants and consultants and academics, both faculty and students, don't add value. Now, obviously, we have to have the rule of law, and we have to avoid becoming a Philistine society. But the fact is, we have, without it being consciously adopted as a policy, deliberately respectabilized the massaging of immense amounts of resources towards the retention of such people in positions that do not, in fact, add value. A person who puts sheet metal on an automobile chassis or works in a bakery or a brewery or extracts resources from the ground or the water adds value. And I am going to, in my concluding remarks, I'm going to propose some alternatives, so it's not just me opposing the other side here. But I think we have to face that fact. And the idea of universality, it has the superficial attractions of simplicity and egalitarianism, but that's not where it leads. That's what we have in our healthcare system. It doesn't work. We're rationing healthcare to the people who can't afford to pay more. The people who can do pay more and get better health care. The fact is we should permit private medicine and allow people who want to use it to do so and concentrate the resources for the good of those who can't afford health care. And in the case of income policy, as I will say when I conclude, we should have an employment and tax plan designed to produce job creation. Of course, we have to alleviate poverty. No sane person in any of the countries covered by this topic would say otherwise, but I will demonstrate when the time runs out in 1 second. I'll demonstrate how better to do it.
Thank you very much, Conrad. That was terrific. You didn't, as you talked about less value-added jobs, mention think tankers, but I can assure you we have our existential concerns on that front. So I think you'll all agree with me that was terrific. We had a very large number of issues, all pertinent to the topic, raised for us. We now go to an even more time-constrained element of the debate, where each member of each side gets 2 minutes for rebuttal. The affirmative side first. Paul, we're back to you. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Bill. It seems to me Conrad and Janice raised 2 points, essentially. Right, that a universal basic income will erode a work ethic, and second, that it'll cost too much. Right? I am amused by the first, because we're never told when we cut taxes for the rich that will decrease work. We're never told. By the way, if you want to see how getting money for nothing decreases work, I can introduce you to trust fund babies who I know who are lazier than the slowest sloth of the Amazon rainforest. And yet, we're never told that when we eliminate or reduce estate taxes and inheritance taxes. It's only when we talk about poor people that somehow they're different. They don't have the work ethic that we do. That is nonsense. They want to work. They just have jobs that don't pay. And more, they will have jobs that don't pay. In Canada, 335,000 Canadian, almost all of them men, work as truck drivers. Another 50,000 as taxi drivers. All of them will lose their jobs in the next 10 years. All of them. The number one employment for women in your country is retail. And that is 371,000 workers, most of them women. 92% of them will lose their jobs in the next 10 years. They need something. And what universal basic income will do is top off low-wage work, which is a very good thing. It will also reward socially beneficial but economically unremunerative work, like raising children, like caring for an elderly, like community and national service. And in terms of cost, again, we always find the cost when we have other priorities. Like in my country, we did bail out the banks, or we just, in my country, passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut, largely for the corporate sector. And so, of course, all the corporations shut down. They quit working because we gave them money for nothing. And we know that that erodes the precious work ethic.
Well done. Thank you for that. And Janice, your 2 minutes starts now.
Sure. First of all, a universal basic income isn't a top-up. It's a money to everybody in the society. You hit a point, you hit a sensitive nerve there when you said just find the money. I was the finance minister of a province where for years, for all kinds of good reasons, governments just found the money. This money, by the way, isn't like a bailout. It's not one time, it's ongoing. And I happened to be the finance minister who came when our province hit the wall. And I'll tell you, when you get to that point, all of this, just find the money, don't worry, it's going to be there. The first people to suffer are the people at the bottom. You try desperately to protect them, but you cannot just find the money. I hope that we've learned that. And when you do actually get to the end of that road, it's the people who are the most vulnerable who suffer the most. Unfairness, yeah, I think we all want to deal with poverty. It's just the best way to do it. But when you're dealing with poverty, and these are models, this isn't people, making this up. The models show that if you're going to actually increase the income of people at the bottom by 50 to 60%, it's the middle class taxpayer that's going to pay. People at $55,000 a year are going to lose money. And that isn't fair. It isn't fair to take from one group that's struggling to pay their bills in order to benefit another group. I think the other point that I would make is we have the basic foundations of a reasonable social safety net. We actually do have a workers' benefit that tops up the income of low-income people. I think we should build on that, streamline what we've got, do a better job. But $300 to $400 billion is going to take so much money away from other programs that benefit everybody, including the poor people, that I can't conscience it. I actually started this research thinking I supported it. But by the end, I just, as a former minister of social services and finance, this is just not the right answer for where we're at now.
Very good. Thank you, Janice. Again, a couple of extremely cogent points. Hugh, over to you.
Thank you. So the notion that there has to be one form of UBI around the world is the notion that no country has the right to make its own domestic decisions about the right design in its own country. The Ontario model for seniors was a top-up. If you were beneath the poverty line, you filed your taxes, you were automatically topped up. No new bureaucrats, no new forms to fill out. It worked automatically, and it worked substantially, and that's what's basically being tested now in the pilot project now going forward in this province. So as we sit here today, Don Drummond told us a few years ago that the cost of poverty to Canada, $90 billion a year, not one time, a year. That does not take into consideration the $200 billion we distribute, governments to people, province and Ottawa, every single year. But the rate of poverty hasn't moved, hasn't gotten any better. So the question you ask yourself, do you keep on repeating the same thing that you know isn't working, or do you have the courage to try something new? And I would argue that the reason Finland, which is deemed to be the happiest country in the world, and the Dutch, who do reasonably well, and Ontario, which is in a period of some considerable economic growth, would be considering these issues because we know the old system isn't working. And allowing that system to continue without engagement makes no sense. One final source. Where did I hear about the guaranteed annual income first? An admission. I was a Richard Nixon Tory. I loved Richard Nixon. He got into some trouble. But before he did that, he went to China, he did a whole bunch of wonderful things. He also put a group together in the White House after he was president, led by a whole group of really interesting Marxists like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Moynihan to develop a family benefits program. So the roots are very conservative and the principles are humane.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear the whole list amplified, but you'll have another turn in a moment. Conrad, over to you.
Thanks, Bill. In response to Paul Begawa, on behalf of both Janice and myself, neither of us was militating against the work ethic or imputing to us that the work ethic was really affected here was mistaken. The fact is, my concerns about the issue do not actually involve the work ethic. What I do say is a job is better than being on welfare. It is better for the individual, and it is better for society, and I don't think anyone would dispute that. That does not mean that anyone who happens to be receiving state benefit is a slacker, and neither of us implied that. Your references to the tax system, I think, were not exact. In the first place, the recent tax cut in your country cut the taxes of every individual in the country except those who are collectively stupid enough to elect governors like the Cuomos and Jerry Brown, who lay off their state income taxes on the other states. People in Texas and Florida who have more intelligent administrations shouldn't be paying for those excesses. The fact is I'm for lower taxes, but I'm for elective taxes as much as possible. A virtual voluntary tax, voluntary spending, elective spending, and a reduction of income taxes, particularly to lower income groups. I'll get to that in my conclusion. As for Hugh Segal, I think we have an election coming up in June, and I think the majority of those who vote, and certainly all those who vote in my household, will be in search of the strong economic growth he purports to find here. But Hugh's a wonderful man, but his arithmetic isn't perfect. Hugh, there were 4 freedoms and not 2 in the Atlantic Charter. My issue was job creation, and the way to do it is not this way.
Again, at the risk of sounding like an impresario who does nothing but watch the clock, I want to commend all of our debaters, not simply for the substance they've put in front of us and the flair with which they delivered it, but the fact that they are sticking to time so admirably. Thank you all. We now go to the questions from the jury. I will quickly prefigure that several jury members sent in some challenging questions and very good ones. Our job was to try and synthesize that, and Hugh will now demonstrate how successful we were into some questions to address either primarily to the affirmative or the negative side, or questions that would be equally suitable to all. Hugh, we are in your hands. There is a microphone approaching from behind you, and we look forward to hearing the questions from the jury.
Thank you very much, Bill. Is it on?
You're good.
The first question is a bit of an amalgam, and it deals with, it's for the affirmative side, deals with conditions and the work ethic issue. Can a UBI truly be conditional only on income? And in terms of fairness, which has been discussed, what about people who could work and won't? It brings to mind St. Paul, who said, "He who does not work shall not eat, shall not be fed," if he could work. Or other questions, how about people with low incomes who are otherwise wealthy? How do you exclude them out of the equation? And what does that mean in terms of analyzing the situation of individuals and their liberty? Or people who just arrived in Canada, what other conditions would we want or need to qualify recipients? Thank you.
I'll answer it in the Canadian context, and Paul may answer it in a larger context. So in terms of people who do not work and how they are addressed, if the program is designed properly, it should encourage work. The basic income pilot in Ontario does something which welfare never did. Welfare said, prove to me you have no income, or if you have income, we're going to take it all back. The actual pilot in Ontario says we're going to top you up to $1,300 a month, and then if you work, you get to keep 50% of that, and the rest will be taxed. So there's some reason to stay in the game, and being in work is the best possible circumstance. Conditionality, really simple. For me, it's income. We all file our taxes. Negative income tax has that universal justification. You all got to file your taxes. It tells you whether you're above the line or beneath the line. Each province, because I think this should start in the provinces, because that's where social progress happens in Canada, should have a resident requirement, which we do have in the pilot project. We've had for healthcare for years in Canada, and it makes perfect sense. And as for those who won't work, 70% of the people in this country who are beneath the poverty line have jobs. In this city, many of them have more than one, and they still can't get above the poverty line. So the on the couch with the bonbons, watching the soap operas, doesn't impress me at all.
Paul, you're a bit constrained, but if you have anything to add, please do.
I do think, and Hugh pointed to this earlier, there has to be flexibility in different provinces in my country, in different states. I do like the idea, in the U.S. we always call the states the laboratories of democracy. I like the idea of these trial runs that are going on. And I wouldn't say that you should have a one-size-fits-all, but the concept itself, things like durational residency requirements, clawbacks for the more well-off, I think are pretty easy fixes.
Thank you. We now go to Janice and Conrad for their response to the question and what they just heard.
I'm just going to make a couple comments and then I'm going to hand it over to Conrad. You can incentivize work. The clawbacks, I'm not a defender of the current welfare system. It's got lots of problems. It's intrusive. It's got too many rules. It's got too much bureaucracy. Fix that. But you can incentivize work without giving people money and saying we're not going to claw it back. That was the whole purpose behind the National Child Benefit. And it worked. It worked in getting people to say, look, if you take care of my kids and give me the same benefits as I would have if I was on welfare, they get their dental care, et cetera, and if you let me keep more of my money when I enter the workforce, I will. And it phases out. So it's not that these problems can't be fixed. I say that there's a more effective and affordable way to fix them than what's being proposed. Go ahead.
I will offer one thing in precisely sequence to what Janice just said. I am in favor, and have written about this occasionally, for, believe it or not, a wealth tax, but a self-liquidating wealth tax applying to really high income and high wealth people that would be, would consist of a tax paid by them, but the use of it would be according to schemes that the taxpayers themselves devised, and they would be approved in the way authentic charities are approved, that they're for real. And they would be designed specifically to reduce poverty. That way we get, and the tax would not be high to begin with, but would come down as identifiable defined poverty came down. That way we get the most commercially and economically astute people in the country directly at work trying to reduce poverty instead of just social workers who, for all their sincerity, have their limitations at that kind of thing. And we get an exact alignment of the interests of the rich and poor. They both want to get rid of poverty. I think we need new solutions. I agree, Hugh and Paul, I agree completely, and I'm sure Janice does, with the idea that everyone has to have a basic level and no one should be below. I disagree how you get there.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to applaud those answers. I think you'll agree with me. That was a tremendous range of ideas and examples that that question prompted. Hugh, more wisdom from the jury.
The next jury question is for the negative team. Hayek, a libertarian icon, called the UBI a wholly legitimate risk protection and a necessary part of the great society in which the individual no longer has claims on the particular small group into which he was born. What did Hayek get wrong?
Go ahead, I'm not sure what he's saying.
Hayek was a wonderful political scientist, but he was a completely incompetent economist. He thought all government spending was mistaken, and I would like the context for that. He didn't approve government spending anything, and so as to that particular quote, I agree that what we should seek is precisely what he said. And at a certain point, only the government can underwrite it. I agree with that. I'm astounded to hear that he ever said that. But ultimately, I think what he felt was that governments could create conditions, if they were advanced countries and sensible governments, where there were no poor people. And that may be right. He may be right. And he was speaking as an Austrian in post-imperial days, and I think it probably is possible in Austria. Just as I think Paul's example of Alaska is not entirely representative. It's a petrostate. It's easy to spread the money around in Kuwait or Qatar or Alaska, but it's a little more complicated and traditional in economic terms parts of his country and other countries. I could come up with surprising quotes for you too, Hugh, but give me a minute.
Janice, do you want to take your 30 seconds to throw a bomb?
A quick comment. I tell my graduate students, don't tell me about what the Scandinavian countries are doing. They have a different demographic, and they will be able to, their people, their taxpayers will tolerate tax rates that North Americans simply won't tolerate. So I'll tell you, our bosses, the voters, aren't going to allow the tax levels that the Finns are going to have to finance their program.
Thanks very much. Over to the other team for their thoughts on this topic.
Yes, if I can defend my brothers and sisters in Alaska, where I did have a son who lived for 5 years, they're not at all different. They just have oil. I'm from Texas. We're just like y'all, except sitting on an ocean of oil. That just means there's more money. It's easier to spread around in that sense because it comes in. You don't have to argue about the tax source, but that's all. And in Alaska, only 1% of Alaskans have said that the annual payment reduces their incentive to work, and I've been there many times. And they're wonderfully hardworking. They're an incredibly diverse state. They have got all the challenges that everybody else has, but unlike my native state of Texas, they decided to take that oil revenue and use it to form at least a modest baseline for everyone else. And so the distribution is not idiosyncratic to Alaska. The source of the revenue is, but again, we can find revenue in a Tobin tax, I think, which people have talked about on financial transactions. Conrad has an interesting new way to find the rich people voluntarily giving up their money, which doesn't happen in the US very often. But we can find the money. And if we do, Alaska shows that actually it works.
Thank you. Hugh, over to you.
So I'm going to quote another famous Marxist, Milton Friedman. And Friedman said, when asked about this some years ago, look, if you made the American government responsible for the Sahara Desert, in 3 years they would have a sand shortage. Give the money to the poor people. They will know what to do with it. That's a conservative who doesn't believe in a large bureaucracy, doesn't believe in the state making judgment about how other people live their lives, doesn't believe in the swells deciding how the ne'er-do-wells live, believes that if you give poor people money, they will know what to do with it. And will there be any gaming of the system? I don't know, Wall Street 07, 08, zero gaming of the system, zero. I would trust poor people, and I think they would be a tremendous resource, and in a short period of time, they'd be paying more tax, which is how we answer some of those.
Thank you. Again, we turn to the jury for a penetrating question.
Jury question number 3. Some critics of a UBI charge that it would subsidize low-wage industries and generally prop up a rotten system. Does that criticism reduce the affirmative side's enthusiasm? Does it increase the negative side's enthusiasm?
So who'd like, yes,
Try
affirmative
that.
side, over to you.
The current system certainly does. In my country, the wealthiest family is the Walton family. There's 6 heirs of the Walton family, 6 of them. They could all fit in my car. I know I'm a liberal, but I have a big SUV. I have a lot of kids. My wife has a Prius with an Obama sticker. It's okay. It comes from the factory that way, but she hasn't scraped it off. Those 6 people could fit in my car, and they would have, in that vehicle, more wealth than 140 million Americans. And yet, 18% of their employees at Walmart are on relief. Walmart employees, owned by the wealthiest people in America, subsidized by the welfare system. So it's going on now, but in just a haphazard and, frankly, I think, stupid way. I don't believe that the fundamental economic system is rotten at all. I am not a socialist. I'm not wealthy enough to be one. But I do think that, here I would paraphrase Winston Churchill, right, who said this about democracy, but I'd say it about capitalism. It's the best of all systems. It's the worst of all systems, except all the others. And so what I want to do is find ways to shore up its problems, not destroy it at all.
Thank you. Hugh, your thoughts?
Well, let me take my colleague's Walmart reference. Let's think of the Walmart model. Cheap goods, low-paid employees, poor customers. It's a perfect model. Works on volume. They do very well. What if you change one piece of that model? Less poor customers. They actually have a bit more income. Therefore, if you're going to hire poor customers to be your employees, you're going to have to pay them a little more money. And guess what? The whole economic system will be enriched because you broke part of the model which kept people economically oppressed. And certainly if we see what happened to seniors in Ontario in '75, when they went from poverty to more income, they lived longer, they spent more money. A whole industry of developing apartments and homes for seniors grew because they had the capacity to finance it. And it did not end up in any way producing bad fiscal results for Darcy McHugh, the most conservative finance minister in the history of this province.
Thank you, Hugh. Propping up capitalism.
I'm all for that. Paul very directly referred to the disparity issue, and again, I think we can all agree it is a terrible problem. My father was an executive, he was a well-to-do man, and he ran a large company, and he calculated that he was well paid, but he received 35 times as much money as the lowest paid person in the company. And that figure today would be 1,000 or something like that. And it offends me culturally that a rap star makes more money in one night than Mozart did in his life, but it's his money. And the answer is not, as is implied in our two opponents' comments, a straight redistribution. I mean, the answer isn't to take the Walmart's money. I actually sold Sam Walton a newspaper, and he was a tough old buzzard. Believe me, he earned his money. But the answer isn't just, as Mr. Lincoln said, you won't save the poor by destroying the rich. And this whole business of taking money from people who've earned it and giving it to people who haven't, for whatever reason, is a dodgy business. We have to do it up to a point, of course, because we all agree, especially in wealthy countries like this, in the United States and other advanced countries, that nobody must be allowed to descend below a certain level, and our system works sufficiently poorly that some people do, and we all recognize the problem. But I think that what's being pitched to here is a straight redistribution. When President Roosevelt set up the modern welfare system, it was a workfare system. It employed millions and millions of people, and I'm shocked, incidentally, that pro-Roosevelt historians like Doris Goodwin and William Leuchtenberg and my late friend Arthur Schlesinger have bought into the line that the U.S. didn't perform as well in job creation and unemployment reduction as the European powers and Japan that simply drafted everybody into the military and war production industries and called it employment. People building the Triberg Bridge were much better employed. But in my conclusion, I will get to how to deal with this. But just a straight appeal against the rich and for the votes of the many is no answer.
We have one more question from the jury. Janice will make sure you get a good kick at this one. And then having heard those answers, we will get a short break, which certainly the debaters have earned, and maybe others feel they have as well. You.
Jury question number 4. The cost of living across Canada and even within provinces varies considerably. Many income supports and other programs also vary from place to place. Should we have a national, if we were to go to UBI, national or provincial UBI? Would it be uniform? Would it vary by region? And if so, would it further balkanize our regions?
Janice, do you want to?
Yeah, good question. We actually haven't even talked about implementing it, what it would be like to implement it, because I think ideally you need a national program. But if you actually, and then, first of all, the National Child Benefit was national, took years to actually work that out. But because it should be the similar coast to coast. But how exactly, besides what you're talking about, how do you deal with the fact that living in rural Saskatchewan isn't as expensive as living in Toronto? And how do you deal with the fact that one of the benefits of having provinces is that the social services are geared to the unique makeup of their population? So I think it would be really interesting if you tried to have a national benefit. Would it actually, what would the provinces be willing to give up? I mean, would the Atlantic provinces be willing to say, well, let's just fold in employment insurance because they're the main beneficiaries of that? That's not going to happen. So the complexity of actually sorting this out, I think, would be very significant. I'm not a fan of the welfare system. It needs lots of changes. But it does have a point. Not everybody is the same. You know, where you live, what your background, whether you're able to work or whether you're not able to work, whether you have a disability, whether you're a senior, all of those things matter when you actually get down to trying to address poverty, which is the goal here. So I think it's a fascinating question, and I think it would be very, very difficult to find an answer that suited both the idea of a national program and the benefits of having the provinces say, but this is geared to what we need. What Saskatchewan needs isn't the same as Ontario.
Yep. Conrad, a soundbite, or are you satisfied with that?
Well, as we all from Canada here know, it is horribly difficult. What you get is concessions to Quebec because they hold a particular ability to act on their own, and then all the unctuous English-speaking provinces say, well, we must be treated the same, and of course we don't agree with them. And you'll get that in all of these fields, and you would know that, Hugh, from your days with Davis.
Sure. Well, there's a segue right across the aisle. Hugh or Paul?
So I think it's one of those false problems. We have a national healthcare system now based on provincial implementation. Transfer payments that are tied to an equalization system, which is different in terms of how the formula produces numbers for each jurisdiction. Nobody dies. We have a way of doing it, and so while I think it should start in the provinces, that's the best place to do this, it'll radiate to Ottawa, just like the Guaranteed Income Supplement replaced the GAINS program in Ontario and similar programs across the country. We can do it. We have done it in the past. CRA today, and this should be a tax-based program. CRA today has different rates of taxation depending on where you live, north of the French River, not, costs, Arctic, etc. It's all doable. It's not unsustainable, and it's one of those faux questions that are raised to discourage courage and innovation on the issue of poverty.
Take that. Paul, you have a minute if you'd like to.
Oh, then I'll take it.
Laboratories
Yes,
of
if you have a
Democracy,
minute.
please do.
I do like the idea of regional experimentation and regional differences and regional disparities. I do. Your country, like mine, is enormously diverse, right? I know it's very different to live in Toronto than Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, where I had a friend, or in my country, New York or Mississippi, right? And yet we find ways to do that. It's one of the things that I think we have to confront is that, yes, there will be challenges and problems and changes and failures and disparities and unfairness in universal basic income because it's life. It's not a perfect solution. That's not the question before you. The question before you is it better than status quo, which my learned opponents have been brilliant at refusing to defend because they can't defend the indefensible. So we have to decide, will we try something new with its attendant problems or not? And I don't want to suggest you be without flaws. If you ever hear of a public policy program that has absolutely no downside, you're dead. You're in heaven, because there's no perfection this side of heaven.
On that somewhat suitably ambiguous note, we now move to a short break, and it is short because we have a commitment to making sure that everyone, that we do wrap up on time. So thank you, debaters. Thank you, jury, for your questions. It'll be a short break. If my schedule is correct, and we seem to be just about dead on, we will be back in our seats at 1:15. And then we will proceed to the closing remarks and the final vote. So thank you all. Well, we now, as advertised, move to the closing remarks, for which the debaters have agreed to hold themselves to 4 minutes each. And we will mix it up this time with the negative side going first. And first for the negative side, I see Janice McKinnon is on her feet, so it's as you choose. Conrad, would you like to go first? It's so exciting. You got to be on your feet. Conrad, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I know I've worked up a tremendous state of suspense here about what I'm going to. Our worthy opponents have uttered the word fairness both directly and a lot of synonyms for it, and have subtly or not so subtly imputed to us the lot of being the uncaring and hard-hearted part of the debate. And that is not the case at all. We all care about the subject. We just differ on how to deal with it. And the suggestions I was going to make are, and I hinted at one of them and explicitly stated one, I think we want to change the tax system around. I did not agree with Stephen Harper's absolute attachment to a reduced HST. I think we should increase taxes on luxury spending and optional transactions, not things like food bought in grocery stores. Everybody has to do that. I mean optional spending by people who can afford to pay a bit more. And that changes the whole psychology of tax collection. It makes it almost a voluntary tax. I mean, if any of us going out to dinner, taking some friends and spending $1,000 in a restaurant, if it cost $1,200, it wouldn't matter particularly. And we should exploit that. It's the soft section of tax collection, and to the extent possible, compensate on the other side by reducing taxes on incomes. Tax levels in this country, as Janice said, are an absolute scandal. A person making over $186,000 pays 70% in taxes of all kinds. It varies a little bit on income tax depending on where you live, but basically 53% here, which is absurd. The government has no right to 53% of anyone's income other than in a great national emergency. And they do not do such a good job of what they do that they have any call on it because of their efficiency or performance in office, any government. And if we did that, I think you would incentivize on the income side and certainly reduce them particularly sharply at the lower end and raise the threshold level. And yet sales taxes do produce astounding amounts of income if you handle them right. I mentioned my idea for a wealth tax, a self-liquidating wealth tax. Wouldn't be a lot of money, but it would align the rich with the poor in a key area. There'd be a lot of innovation. It was like the original welfare reform in the Reagan era, where you got different welfare systems in different states, and they learned from each other. Tommy Thompson, and Democrats and Republicans both. It was a great cross-pollination. I think we have to try and allow the free market to have a greater influence than it does on the kind of employment that goes on. As I said, there are too many of highly talented, highly qualified people not adding value. I think what we want to do is, rather than just do what is proposed by the opposite side here, we want to encourage two pools of sort of catchments of labor. One, and call it, serve us if you want. We need bigger military. First of all, the actual technical side of it is the best form of stimulus spending. The U.S. does it very effectively with Boeing and General Dynamics and others. It's the cutting edge of technology. It is also, as the Americans have shown us, the best form of adult education. And we should do that. We need a much bigger military. I agreed with most of Stephen Harper's foreign policy, but he was the mouse that roared. No one listened to Stephen because we only had about 20 warplanes, and our chief defense maintenance ship had to be towed to the great arsenal of democracy in Pearl Harbor.
Thank you. A little bit of new material in the conclusion, but we're not sticklers for form. Thank you very much. By my program, we have Hugh Siegel next, and apparently by Hugh's as well. Thank you.
So let me start by saying that I agree with Conrad, that a very good thing for the economy of this country and for our national standing and for putting some substance behind the proposition, quote, Canada is back, is if we actually had a deployable military. And we know for a fact that if you had a deployable military, which would be 150,000 regular and reserve forces, not just 63,002, and if we had the capacity to sustain that, a lot of people would find superb work. And ROTP programs on our campuses would be another opportunity to actually translate more folks into better working jobs. I was a great supporter of Prime Minister Mulroney. And you recall, as he will tell you if he were right here, that was Michael Wilson's idea to bring in the GST. But the truth is that while that may have reduced the Mulroney government standing from 32% to 7%, which meant at that moment in time more people thought Elvis Presley was alive than were planning to vote for our party, it was structurally the right thing to do. We know that. We also know that taking Donald MacDonald's recommendation from the Royal Commission on Canada's Economic Prospects, commissioned by Pierre Trudeau, free trade, leap of faith, was also the very substantive, not without risk, but important, courageous thing for Mr. Mulroney to do with support of many people in this room. But that same MacDonald Royal Commission had another recommendation: to bridge the ups and downs that trade flows based on input costs around the world will produce for Canadian employees, we should have a guaranteed annual income. And Mr. Mulroney did not take that recommendation. He gave it to the Conseil de Patronat in Quebec to reflect on. And guess what? They said, unemployment insurance is there for that. That's what we need. That's good enough. And then the Mulroney government, for fiscal reasons, slashed unemployment insurance. And when Craincha came in, he slashed it even worse. So as we sit here tonight, 40% of Canadians who are out of work and trying to find work are not eligible for employment insurance. They fall into the welfare program. The welfare program is already underfunded, and it's based on rules and stigma and discouraging work when we want people to be able to work, which is why a basic income top-up run through the tax system makes good sense. And by the way, Conrad's point about a luxury tax for those who can afford it would be a way for us to test What will we have to do with the GST for the $1,500 dinner as opposed to the $350 dinner? What do we have to do to the GST on a graduated basis for the $74,000 vehicle as opposed to the $21,000 vehicle? I think that would be one of the areas which proves that even an opponent of this change has the creative integrity to say there's a way to raise more money. I rest my case.
Very good, and again, a little bit new material in the conclusion, no penalty as far as I'm concerned. Janice, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to remember what's being debated here. I was a Minister of Social Services. I've seen poverty up front. I want to alleviate poverty. I'm not saying that we should just carry on the way we are. It's just fine. No. And I'm worried about my kids and my grandkids and what's going to happen to them with AI and technological changes. The issue is this the best way to deal with those problems? And let's be clear what we're talking about here. We're talking about a payment to every single person in Canada, whether they need it or not, of $1,000, $1,300 a month, and not clawing any of that back. That is massive amounts of money. So you got to ask yourself, is this the best way to spend that money? The other thing is, this would be a massive undertaking, provincial programs, federal programs. Is this where we really should be devoting our energies? And I say no. And I think the biggest thing that is a problem for me as a former Minister of Social Services, I was Minister of Finance and I was Minister of Social Services, I really had struggled more with social services because I couldn't see easy answers. They don't exist. Poverty is not unidimensional. It's multifaceted. If money could fix poverty, I would have a whole bunch of people that I would introduce those people to because it's much more than poverty. The problem is that if you want to actually tackle poverty, there are much more effective ways to do it. Target it to the group and their needs. Let's take some examples. I saw these people. Some of the most common people that are persistently poor are single parents. So what do they need? Well, yeah, they need more money, but they also need that child benefit, which is probably a program that would go, the prescription drugs, the eyeglasses. They need affordable, accessible daycare. You can't have that and spend all the money on this. They need training, many of them. You can't have the training and afford all this. And they need subsidized housing. Those are the things that are going to help them get to the point that they can stand up with pride and say, I can raise my family and I can see a bright future for them. Let's take something else that won't be solved by money. If you look at poverty, a lot of the underlying issues for the poor are mental health and addictions issues. And so do you think a bigger monthly payment is going to help those people? And in fact, right now in Canada, one of our biggest problems is we don't have enough funding for mental health. There are people who need the services, want help, they want treatment, they can't get it. So are we going to spend billions on this new thing and yet have enough money to actually deal with the underlying causes of poverty? My final point is the strategy I talked about. There is a way to actually try to get those people who are going to be displaced into new jobs, but you're not going to do it on the back of an envelope. It takes huge amounts of energy and time. Governments are going to have to try to map out which jobs are going to be lost, which are the new jobs of the future. They show you how to do it, but it's time consuming. All the different governments are going to have to work together with business, educators, get on the same page. And we're going to have to totally change our attitudes. Instead of people looking for, I have to hire somebody out there because I have a new position, you have to think about, who do I have here that I might be able to reposition into the job of the future? So my point is that this is a much better way, targeting poverty and targeting the needs and changing some of the systems and dealing with the displaced and developing a strategy to help them.
Hear, hear. Excellent. Paul, you're our wrap-up.
Thank you. First, thank you again for hosting this, for inviting me, and again, Aaron, thank you for sponsoring. Conrad used a very important word, efficiency. And I think that's at the heart of the question. We are heading into a crisis because our businesses have become so wonderfully, beautifully, perfectly efficient that they don't need employees anymore. In 1979, which happens to be the year I graduated from high school, General Motors was the largest corporation in America, most profitable as well. The most profitable corporation in America was General Motors. It employed 618,000 Americans. The most profitable American corporation today is Apple. It employs 47,000. We have a crisis of work, and it is coming. We are watching it. A tsunami in the middle of the Pacific is only about 3 meters, but by the time it hits the shore, it's 30. It's 3 now. It may be getting to 9, but it's going to be 30. It may be 90 by the time this comes. And so the question before the House is, what will we do? Will we say, in the way that Janice does, and I admire it, we're going to figure this out for you. We're going to find the jobs of the future, and we'll direct you toward them. We'll decide if you need childcare rather than if you can decide to stay home. We'll decide if you need job training. The beauty of universal basic income, it is, as Conrad said, efficient. It does not require a bureaucracy so hated that the women who work behind the welfare counter have to stand behind bulletproof glass. It does not require an army of social workers that I know Conrad is so fond of. It simply requires common sense. I do not believe, I don't, that drug and alcohol addiction, for example, is somehow more prevalent among the poor than the rich. I've been blessed. I grew up very middle class. Now, because of fate, fortune, and good luck, and hard work, I know lots and lots of rich people. Believe me, there are drug and alcohol and mental health problems among the rich. We just call it eccentricities. The beauty of the universal basic income is it actually removes the stigma. It removes the bureaucracy. It removes the inefficiency. And it treats people like thinking, decent actors. Like if we give them a little more money, they will know what to do with it. This is a profoundly conservative idea, which is why Friedrich Hayek supported it, which is why Milton Friedman supported it, which is why Ronald Reagan supported it, which is why Richard Nixon supported it. They all did so, though, in a more theoretical way, in a more theoretical time. We need to support universal income for the same reason that Noah needed an ark. There's a tsunami coming. And we will have to decide how we approach that. And the status quo is absolutely untenable. I will say, again, my great admiration for both Conrad and Janice for ceding that point, that the status quo is unsustainable and it's unworkable. And they are grappling, as we are, with new and different and better ideas. I just think sometimes it's good to begin with the obvious. And most people are poor because they don't have enough money. Not because they're slothful or indolent or drug addicted or somehow immoral. They just don't have enough money. And we in this beautiful, wonderful, efficient system that we have, are about to create a whole lot more of them. Abraham Lincoln actually did say this: the good Lord must love common people because he created so many of them. Well, in my country and yours, in most Western democracies, we are going to see an explosion of people who no longer have meaningful work or incomes to match it. And if we don't find new and creative and efficient solutions for that, then shame on us when the tsunami hits our shores. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I speak confidently for the room in saying those were outstanding summations. And we now go to a second round of voting. The jurors have their paper ballots. You all should, I trust, have your clickers. I look to my colleagues who are handling the sort of technological interface here. And while they're doing that, let me, because I think it's appropriate, just say a couple of things. First of all, I do a certain amount of work on topics that have been dealt with today. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from each of the presenters, and I think this has been just a terrific session, a lot of wisdom and a lot of wit. So thank you one more time for that. I'm getting a signal. Do we need to? to help me. Okay, so the clickers, what would you like me to say to everyone who did not yet click? Here on the screen. Yeah. I try to take instruction. Should Western democracies such as Canada establish a universal basic income to help their citizens cope with the disruptive effect of new technologies and artificial intelligence? I'm demonstrating why artificial intelligence could be a useful thing to add. If you agree, you press A for 1, B for 2 as you disagree, and C or 3 if you are unsure. And we're counting down. Am I going to be pressured for more jokes at the front here, or did you try to attempt a serious summation? Well, we're going to continue with this sort of discussion for a long time. Chris Reagan in the audience may remember ages ago a discussion of marginal effective tax rates and the cityscape that you get as income goes up and people encounter various notches and valleys and clawbacks that sometimes are 100% or even above it. So there's your argument for doing something to smooth all these things out. And that's a very important instinct and a very healthy thing to try and do. And at the same time, to make sure that in those bottom reaches, there's something available for anyone who would otherwise be destitute. But at the same time, in-kind transfers and other things that where we're able to direct more resources to people who we can clearly target as needing them, those are going to be carve-outs. Those are going to be exceptions. And so working out how you bring those two ideas together is an ongoing challenge. And of course, we also can debate whether what's happening to jobs in the current circumstances like agricultural jobs a century ago, or is there something qualitatively different that's going to be harder to adapt to? We don't know, but we want to make sure we're ready to handle whichever it is. I am now getting thumbs up from over there, so the suspense, the drum roll, and... okay, we've had a little bit of persuasion. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't comment on this. I will let you read the numbers for yourselves. But if there has been a change, I think the credit that goes to the side that swayed some opinion does not take much away from the arguments and the persuasiveness of the side that presented the previously dominant opinion, and in fact the still dominant opinion. We will arrange a separate debate during the reception, at which we will we'll put the jury up against the rest of the audience. Perhaps that's the right thing to do next. It would be gilding the lily for me to say anything more about the substance of the debate, but it is entirely appropriate for me to say that I think the speakers have done a tremendous job. The debaters have put a lot of interesting facts in front of us. At the break, I had a number of people ask me, will there be some record of this available? And we're very eager to make sure that this wisdom is available in a lasting form as well. I want to thank the jury members, not just for having voted now and considered the question, but also for helping us with the questions that I think brought out a lot of interesting facts and observations. To all of you in the room, for your good-natured support for the debaters and for being here and helping to launch this event. We very much appreciate your being here. And of course, Aaron and Heather, thank you very much for the support that made this event possible. If you wish to stay and enjoy more appetizers and drinks, please do. I know a number of you will want to talk to the debaters. Some of you may also want to talk to the jury members. I wouldn't discourage that. We will open the doors. The staff will be passing the trays. One more round of applause, please, for our debaters. Paul, Hugh, Janice, Conrad. That's not the passive-aggressive version. Yes.